mic check, please.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ducks Unlimited podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jennings.
I'm your host, Dr. Mike Brasher.
My name is John Gordon. I'll be your host.
And I'm your host, Katie Burke.
Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you, the DU Podcast.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Ducks Unlimited podcast. I'm your host, Mike Brasher. Today we are going to be talking about some pretty significant weather developments that have been impacting the western U.S. for, I don't know, the past several weeks, and you could probably even go back even farther than that. We've spoken in the past with some of our biologists out there. Virginia Getz most recently giving us an update on California conditions. And of course, you go all the way back to the last summer and even before that, and we were talking about like extreme exceptional drought. And here we are now to talk about not drought, but deluge. And so joining me on this episode is another one of our guests from past years and past episodes, Dr. Fritz Reid from out in California. Fritz, welcome back.
Thank you.
Fritz, I think there have been some recent changes in kind of your career status. So why don't you kind of do that for us? But in doing so, I want you to kind of give people a refresher of what you previously did for Ducks Unlimited, your position, and then kind of what you're doing now.
Sure. So I was the very first director of conservation planning for Ducks Unlimited back in the mid-90s. And I had that job up through the mid-2000s when I took over as a director of boreal and Arctic conservation. I've had the pleasure of working out of the West my whole career with ducks, having grown up and gone to grad school in the Midwest. But really enjoyed the Pacific Flyway from Alaska to Mexico, and it's been a wonderful ride. I retired after 33 years in November, but I immediately took a position as the senior advisor on the boreal and Arctic conservation efforts, because I think we're looking to pivot and continue efforts in the boreal and try and help DU Canada in their efforts, working with territorial, provincial, and federal governments, and most importantly, the indigenous governments in what happens to boreal landscapes.
Yeah, so this is a little bit of a transition era for us, I guess, as you're retiring, and then we're looking to see what we're going to be doing next, and so it's nice that we're able to kind of do that and hang on to your expertise for a little bit longer before you fully retire. So glad to hear that. And
you bet.
As I said, we've spoken with Virginia in the past on sort of the habitat conditions, hunting conditions out there, and I thought it'd be good to get you on this episode because, if I'm not mistaken, you hunt mostly in more of the southern portion of the Central Valley, the grassland district. Do I understand that correctly?
Yes, I'm a member of a club in the grasslands, which is the single largest remaining wetland grassland complex in California. It represents about 140,000 acres that includes federal, state, and mainly duck clubs. And it is a truly unique hunting experience. It's really wide open pintail flats, probably most similar to what you see in coastal Louisiana, wide open areas, moist soil. And it traditionally, the county of Merced has the highest harvest of waterfowl of any of the counties in the United States. The harvest is principally green-winged teal with a strong complement of widgeon, of pintails and ringneck ducks, of all things.
Yeah. Pintail harvest would be higher if they allowed you to shoot a few more of those too, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. It'd be a lot higher.
Yeah. And that Merced being the number one duck harvest county in North America is a surprise to a lot of people. But you can look at some of those county-based harvest maps, and there's that little county out there. I mean, the entire Central Valley of California lights up, but there's that one. And I remember whenever I first started looking at some of those maps, I'm like, man, I did not expect that. You think about Cameron Parish, Louisiana. You think about some of the counties in Arkansas, and a few other places. But wow, yeah, Merced County out in Central Valley of California. That's it.
Absolutely.
Fritz, we have a lot to talk about here in terms of weather. Before we do that, I want to back up a little bit and give you an opportunity to share with us how your hunting season has gone. Going into the hunting season out west, we talked about the greatest challenge likely being waterfowl hunters being able to actually find water, find places to hunt ducks. Things began to turn around shortly after the season opened, but kind of from your perspective, from your experiences in the Grassland district, how did the season unfold, and how were things going until, let's just say, the series of atmospheric rivers kind of changed things for you?
Well, you bet. Well, as you've already talked about, it was very scary with so little water available in the Klamath Basin, in the Intermountain West. Birds would basically leave the prairies, leave Idaho and Western Washington, and pretty much make a direct shot down to the Sacramento Valley in order to get food and water resources. And so what happened was, and you noted too that there was almost a halving of the amount of rice that was planted in the Sac Valley this year. And there was a great concern by waterfowl enthusiasts that because of the importance of rice and rice habitat in the winter, very, very concerned about where birds were going to be able to locate and forage. Likewise, the rice industry is important in providing water to moist soil duck clubs as well, and makes water available to some of the refuges as well. So it was a scary time, and sure enough, by early fall, there'd been about 55% of the normal amount of rice planted in the Sac Valley. And in most cases, there was no water available in those other areas. So at best, there was really sparse weeds. And in many cases, guys dished that up. And so it was slicked off. There was no food, even if it did flood later in the winter. So in early fall, it was tough. If you had pumped water, either in rice or in moist soil, you had habitat and you had a lot of birds. And there was great concern that we would see big disease outbreaks, botulism early in the fall, but most concerned about avian influenza and cholera later in the winter. What we saw birds move to the traditional areas when there's drought. The Sassoon Marsh, which is part of San Francisco Bay, a real traditional area. It's tidal wetlands. But the challenge there was it was hot water. I mean, it was very, very saline. And even though you provided water on the landscape, how long birds would stay there was really unknown. The good news was that guys in the Sassoon Marsh did well early on. Traditionally, the Delta, which is where the Sacramento comes down from the south, from the north, the San Joaquin comes from the south, and the Cosumnes and McCulmany come in from the Sierra, and they create this amazing complex of about 54 islands in the Delta. And the Delta traditionally is a very, very important late winter habitat. So December, January, typically we see large number of birds there. Well, even early on, if you had any water whatsoever in the Delta, birds were using that heavily. And it was especially used not only by ducks, but by large numbers of geese. Lots of white fronts, lots of Aleutian Canada geese using the Delta. And then the grasslands was used. The challenge there, the grasslands has a limited amount of water under the Central Valley Project Improvement Act. And based on the water conditions, the Grasslands Water District could provide 15 inches of water per acre for any club that was in the Grasslands Water District, any National Wildlife Refuge, any state area. The challenge being that if you took that water early, it was probably going to evaporate. And so we had some clubs that flooded early, some clubs that decided they're not going to flood until well into Thanksgiving, a full month after the start of the season. And so it was sporadic amount of habitat initially available.
Yeah. And so then, Fritz, somewhere along the way, y'all had one of these first atmospheric rivers or systems move in that provided some very beneficial rainfall, and we had spoken with Virginia Getz about that one. Matter of fact, let me just stop right here, and I always like to do a timestamp on these, and it's like Friday the 13th, January the 13th. Friday the 13th is when we're recording this one, kind of give people an idea of the sort of the temporal perspective that we're offering here. But at that time, last time we spoke with Virginia, that rain had been enough to open up some of the refuges, some of the management areas. I mean, that's how bad the drought was, is that when the waterfowl season first began, or at least maybe before it, there were some areas, some of these classic waterfowl hunting areas that were not open or not open to their full extent. So that was a good thing. But then how did things unfold from there? Like, did it go from kind of that middle of the road, we've got a few areas open, then all of a sudden to Deluge and maybe, because I know recently there's been some closures of some areas. Kind of, what did that period of transition look like, and what did it mean for hunters?
Well, what it meant was, as clubs were able and refuges were able to flood, the hunting, if you had water, turned out to be exceptional. So the Butte Sink area of traditional clubs in the Sac Valley, the Delta, the Grasslands, District 10, which is an area in the Sac Valley on the east side, these areas really were phenomenal. And birds moved back and forth within those areas that had water, but overall, it was really some great hunting. I knew a number of clubs that had averages 6.5, even to 7 birds per day per hunt across all the hunters. So in the Pacific Flyway, you can harvest 7 birds a day. So it was pretty exceptional.
I'm glad you added that part about, clarifying that in the Pacific Flyway you can harvest 7 ducks a day, because I'm sure some folks would be scratching their head like, wait a minute.
Yeah. So. and what people are seeing is, with the tremendous number of white fronts and white geese that have come down, the opportunities are phenomenal, both for just goose hunting and for a duck goose combination. But then we really started to get atmospheric rivers coming through, and probably right about Christmas time was when we saw the real change. And after Christmas straight on, it's been pretty much raining every day. And one wonders, should we build the ark or not? What's happened is there's been flooding to the extreme, so that, first of all, areas that did not had not been flooded to date were inundated. So a bunch of the rice that did not have the ability to flood, did not have any water, gained water, and so picked up a lot of birds moving into those sites as they became available. And so there were guys that had not been able to hunt because they had dry fields that they'd rented, but then were able to move into those fields. And so there were new opportunities out there, and to take advantage of fields that were flooded that hadn't been rented even at that point. So there was a time where there was new opportunities, but some of the traditional areas were getting a bit deep, and that occurred like in the Butte Sink, and a lot of those clubs actually were flooded too great, so that they were not hot spots at all. And now you see areas like the grasslands, like in the Delta, that in clubs it's getting so that the birds are spread out to such an extent that even though you've got good moist soil, even though you've got good habitat, the birds are spread out in such a way that it's pretty tough for the hunter. You still have opportunities, but it's nowhere near what it looked like in early and mid-December.
Fritz, that's a lot of great information thus far, and we've got a few more things to cover. I will note, just kind of for our listeners, your signal may be a little bit in and out there, and it could be because you're experiencing some torrential rain there right now. You were telling us just as we started this that you got a hailstorm coming on you. So apologize if the connection there is a little in and out, but sometimes we have to deal with this. Fritz, I want to ask you about a few other things. Have there any of the hunting areas been closed as a result of all the rain, and then kind of where do we go from here? And then also want to get an update on sort of what water conditions, snowpack conditions are looking like, because those types of things become important as we look forward to the spring and summer. So hang with us, Fritz. We'll be right back after the break. Everybody, welcome back. We're here with Dr. Fritz Reid out in California, giving us an update on all that has happened out there here over the hunting season, and we're going to be looking forward a little bit to the breeding season as well here in a moment. But Fritz, kind of close things out for us, I guess, at least in terms of all this rain that you've received. I kind of keep up with some of this on the Weather Channel. I noticed something the other day. It said maybe it was as of yesterday, Sacramento, California had 14 consecutive days with rain, and maybe you can, I don't know if it's raining there now, but anyway, it's been a lot of rain. That's well above average rain totals. Have we seen any areas, public areas that have to be closed because of flooding threats?
Yeah, absolutely. China Island, which is a big area down in the grasslands, it's a state area. It's been closed. Major flooding there. Most of the areas have a couple blinds that they've excluded in the draw because of flooding. I know of several clubs that have closed down because of access challenges, roads wiped out, and so it's when you get conditions like this, it's always important to be safe. There's fast, rapid waters. It's really important, if you're driving, not to drive through floodwaters if you can avoid it. Don't drive through floodwaters at night. Practice good boating safety. Wear life preservers, and remember that there are times that it's better not to go. That's what I can tell you, because you want to be careful. You don't want to get yourself, your partners, your kids in dangerous situations. But the good news is that for bird survival, this kind of rain is really good. And it's really good as the pairs move out, spread out. We were seeing some problems with avian diseases. We were seeing dead birds, especially white geese, that were being picked up. And both cholera and avian influenza was found in some of the necropsies. But with the rains and spreading the birds out, I have not been hearing about any disease problems once the rains happen. So that's one of the positive aspects. Clearly, the most important aspect is water storage. We still have a long way to go. Believe it or not, we could still be Shasta Reservoir critical conditions. Shasta is the largest, it's the federal reservoir. It's located above Redding. To date, right today, I'm looking at the website, Shasta is 45% full. Now, it's got a long ways to go, but it was down to 32%. So it's gained 13% of its total capacity. And if we continue to get some of these storms, maybe that will continue to increase. Orville is the big reservoir on the state side. That's currently at 51%. So we're seeing some increases of the reservoirs in the valley, and that's very, very important, not simply for ducks, but for the all-important agriculture of California and for the urban users as well. Now, one of the questions has been, where are we at outside of the Central Valley? And so I was able to look up snowpack in Utah, and in the Bear River flowage region, which is Logan and that area in the northeast part of Utah, they're currently at 170% of norm of snowpack. The Weber and Ogden areas, the Weber is one of the big tributaries going into Great Slave Lake. They're at 200%, and then just south of there, around the southern part of the lake, they're at 213%. So it's really good conditions, snow conditions in Great Salt Lake. The other thing is, you look at snowpack for the Central Valley. The snowpack is really nature's reservoir for water. That's where we get so much of our water for agriculture in the summer. And right now we're at 280% of norm in the Southern Sierra, about 200% of norm in the Central Sierra, and about 185% in the Northern Sierra. So again, great conditions of snowpack right now. We don't want it to let up, but it really looks phenomenal.
So, Fritz, one of the things, I'll back up a little bit here. If people found themselves doing a double take, I caught it, and it's a byproduct of where you have worked for much of your career here recently. I think you said you said Great Slave Lake. You said it the first time, but then you almost said it the second time and corrected yourself. But we're talking the Great Salt Lake there, and I'm also glad that you mentioned the part about we're in a good position now, but we need to continue to see, more precipitation, or at least hang on to what we have, because the percentages that you talk about, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're talking about like 200% of normal at this date, right? And not necessarily 200%, et cetera, of like peak or anything of that nature. Because if I'm not mistaken,
absolutely,
maybe it was even last year when in early January, some of the snowpack was at 100 and something % of normal, and folks were kind of optimistic, but then things kind of dried up. And by the time spring rolled around, snowpack was only at like 30% of normal, something of that nature, right?
That's absolutely correct. And we saw last year, January and February as the driest conditions that had ever been recorded since the 1800s. So this year, the period after Christmas, those 15 days in San Francisco were the wettest recorded in San Francisco, except for 1862 and 1866. And 1866 was the Great Flood of California. So we have gotten a tremendous amount of water, a tremendous amount of snow in the Sierras, but we don't want it to let up. We'd like maybe it to let up right now for the flooding, but the snowpack that's great, and we'll take whatever we can get.
Yeah, Fritz, kind of to that point about the harm being caused by some of that flooding. I know it's washing out roads. I know it's, I think also a dozen and a half people's lives have been lost as a result of some of the flooding out there. So these type of things, exactly as you say, you want this precipitation for the integrity of the systems out there and the importance of that water. But man, we wish it wouldn't come at such extremes the way we're seeing. But when you talk to climate experts, they will tell us these are the type of extreme swings that we probably need to become need to expect a bit more frequently. And we're not talking about just out west. We see it. We're seeing it everywhere. These major swings seem to be a bit more common these days. So yeah, a lot of things to consider there, and we hope things settle down. But then you can maintain some precipitation at more responsible levels. Let's say going forward. The other area that we're all interested in is going to be the Klamath Basin and the snowpack areas that feed it. What can you tell me about it?
Well, and Klamath is interesting because there has been snow in the Klamath Basin, but a lot of it has melted to date. It's been followed by rains, and so they're showing 0 inches of snowpack in Klamath Falls and directly surrounding Klamath Falls. Now, they've had above normal rainfall. Rainfall's right at 150%. So that's very positive. But typically we see snow late winter, like right about now through March in the Klamath Basin. And that kind of precip is really important in maintaining those habitats in that basin.
Well, it's good to hear about that above average precipitation. I think I had asked someone else about, how does the precipitation fall in that Klamath region? Is it rain? Is it snow? And sounds like it can be a little bit of both, kind of this time of year. And so we'll continue to keep an eye on that. And boy, I hope I'm certain that it's going to take a great deal more precipitation in that basin as well to kind of get us back to a point where we would feel a level of comfort over any short period of time. The same thing, as you said, is going to be the case in California. I was, again, on the Weather Channel this morning. I was watching, they were showing the drought monitor for California over the last 3 weeks, and the improvement in drought conditions, the lessening of drought conditions is certainly noticeable. But surprisingly, most of California still continues to be classified in the hydrological drought category. It's a result of the way they measure drought and index it, and it's not just how much precipitation they get. I think a number of other things play into it as well. But so yeah, there's still, as you said, potential for some drought implications here as we go forward.
It's raining so hard, I'm having a hard time hearing you.
Oh my goodness. Wow. So more rain is being added as we speak. Is it too early to think about what this all the increased rain may mean for the potential to plant more rice this year? When will farmers start knowing something about that?
They'll certainly have to make a decision by March, probably no later than April. And, I think there's a lot of hope that we can get back into a more normal rotation. Certainly where we can get 500 plus thousand acres of rice in the Sacramento Valley, it'll be good for ducks, good for agriculture, good for the state of California. And that's what we certainly hope for.
Well, Fritz, we've covered a lot of ground here. Anything else that I have one final question for you here in a minute, but anything else kind of drought related, habitat condition related that we need to make sure we cover before we get out of here?
Well, one thing is that it's been really tough with the long-term drought here in California for breeding birds. And people are already thinking that, with a strong flooding effort that's currently occurring, it's going to really wipe out a lot of the mammalian predators. And provided that there are areas for nesting, for brood areas, we could see a pretty decent first cut at breeding for mallards, for gadwall, for cinnamon teal, for wood ducks in California this year.
Boy, that would be the first time in 2 or 3 or maybe 4 years that we've had a strong breeding effort there in California, right?
Absolutely. It's almost been 10 years since we've had a really strong breeding effort. I mean, there are certain spots, Assume Marsh is one that we traditionally see mallards and gadwall in pretty good numbers, but to see it throughout the valley and in the foothills would really be phenomenal.
One other question, and this is in addition to the final one that I'll ask you. This just kind of occurred to me. I'm thinking about this from a Ducks Unlimited perspective, and I know the work that you do is kind of mainly outside of California, but you're there. You know Ducks Unlimited. You know the work that we do. How do events like this, where we get abundant rain, widespread flooding, how does that affect our ability to deliver habitat projects in the short term? And then what do we think about and what do we look at in terms of long-term opportunities or cost associated with any of these flooding events?
And certainly in the short term, we have to mobilize out of a lot of these basins so equipment is not washed away. And a lot of our contractors are scrambling to shore up any structures that are potentially washed away. But in the short run, we really have to mobilize out of the basins, but quickly move in once the rains start to subside and get back into working in these restoration areas. And it also points to areas where maybe there's some infrastructure challenges, like culverts that are too small. We have the ability to put in a different conveyance system that makes the system a lot more functional. That's what our biologists and our engineering teams will really work on and are currently working on to try and figure out where best to stay active.
Yeah. That's much the same way it affects us in every other region, that are prone to these kind of flood events. The southern region is a classic example of that. Anytime we have extreme rainy periods along the coast of Louisiana or in the Mississippi Alluvial Valley, if we have river flooding, it's those same type of things have to occur. You got to get out of the areas where you're working on the project, then you got to go back in, then you look at other potential solutions. And increasingly, Fritz, as we're thinking about sort of natural infrastructure type of projects, these type of flooding occurrences, as you said, may make us aware of alternative designs that we can consider in the face of likely increased extremes of these type of weather events. So there's a whole lot of things that go through our mind whenever that we have to do, and then that we reflect on, that go through our minds, that influence how Ducks Unlimited is making decisions about our conservation, where and what type, and what those projects look like, right?
Absolutely.
Final question for you, Fritz, and I hope it's a fun one. How much more hunting opportunity do you have this year? Have you been flooded out, or are you going to have some more opportunities to get out?
Well, I honestly believe that it's going to be really tough in the next week. Maybe the last 2 weeks we'll have some opportunities, but certainly not as good as the early part of the season. But it's great to get together with folks that we haven't seen over the pandemic, and we can always cook up some crabs and have a nice dinner and hope we get a few birds in the morning. That's my plan. All
right. Well, it sounds like a great plan. I wish you luck and hope y'all can get into a few birds. If you can't, I know you're going to have a great time socializing and visiting with friends and eating and probably taking a few sips of a drink as well.
Oh, that's possible. That's possible. There's a little bit of wine out here.
Yeah, I'm sure. I've heard, and I've heard you're a pretty good connoisseur of that wine. So, Fritz, thank you so much. Thanks for everything you do for Ducks Unlimited and have done over your career, and happy to have you around in this next phase of your career, at least for a little while longer.
You bet. Well, thanks, Mike, and it's been great talking with you, and we'll keep you up to speed with the birds we see.
A special thanks to our guest on today's episode, Dr. Fritz Reid out in California. We appreciate his insight on what's happening out there and how their season's been going. We also thank our producer, Chris Isaac, for the terrific job that he does with these episodes and getting them out to you. And to you, the listener, we thank you for your time and support of the podcast, and we thank you for your support of wetland and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the ducks. Stay tuned to the ducks.